Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your complex ideas and fascinating sources and try to distill them into insights that just click. Today, we're plunging into a concept that sounds, well, ancient, mystical, and pretty profound: the Akashic Records. You've asked us to unpack a whole stack of detailed sources about these records, and our mission today is really to cut through the noise. We'll explore their surprising origins, delve into what proponents actually claim they are, how they're accessed, and then, crucially, we'll bring in the scientific and psychological perspectives to see what else might be going on.
Yeah, and what's really interesting here, I think, is how this seemingly single concept has such a rich, almost multi-layered history. It evolves quite significantly over time. It's a great example of how spiritual ideas aren't static. They're shaped by cultural needs, intellectual currents.
Exactly. So if you're ready to get a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed about the Akashic Records, let's unpack this. Let's start right at the beginning, because this is where I found it gets really interesting. Many people assume the Akashic Records are some ancient, unbroken tradition, but our sources tell a pretty different story.
Right, which raises the question, what did Akasha even mean before it got linked to records? The foundation is actually the Sanskrit word Akasha.
Akasha, meaning...
It means space or sky, sometimes atmosphere.
Okay, so nothing about a library there.
Hmm.
In ancient Indian philosophies like, say, Samkhya and Vedanta, Akasha was seen as the most subtle of the five physical elements. Like the primordial stuff everything else comes from, the medium, not the message, or the memory in this case.
Precisely. Swami Vivekananda, who was key in bringing Hindu thought west, talked about Akasha and Preka space and life force as the two fundamental building blocks.
And in other systems too, like Nyavaishanka, it was the substratum of sound. Jainism saw it as a fundamental substance providing space for everything else. Buddhism too, right? Akasadaptu.
Yes, across all these diverse ancient systems, the concept of Akasha as an informational archive, like a library, is just conspicuously absent. Its role was the stage, the medium, the source, not the script itself. And this absence, this kind of empty space in the meaning, created what you could call a semantic void.
A semantic void. I like that. Let's unpack that because it seems crucial for understanding how the records part got tagged on. The West in the 19th century, especially the occult revivalists, they were obsessed with uncovering hidden histories, weren't they? Atlantis, Lemuria, and finding new spiritual authority. Akasha sounds like a perfect candidate.
It really was, and this transformation was primarily pushed by the Theosophical Society. Helena Blavatsky, one of the founders, she introduced Akasha as this primordial element. But, importantly, she also wrote about something else, these indestructible tablets of the astral light. That idea came from earlier Western occultists, the idea that thoughts and actions leave a trace.
Okay, but here's the kicker, right? Our sources say Blavatsky herself didn't actually connect the dots. She didn't use the phrase Akashic Records to link Akasha to these recording tablets.
That's correct. It's a really surprising fact for many people.
And didn't she also warn about this astral light, something about it being illusion?
She did. She called it the Great Sea of Illusion, Maya, full of distorted reflections. She explicitly warned clairvoyants against getting drowned in an ocean of self-deception when trying to perceive things there.
Wow. So the person who brings Akasha to the West is also saying, be careful, what you see there might not be real. So who did coin the term Akashic Records then?
That credit seems to go to Alfred Percy Sinnett. He used it in his 1883 book, Esoteric Buddhism, but it was really cemented and popularized by Charles Webster Leadbeater. Around 1899, he explicitly named the Akashic Records and claimed he could read them to get details about lost civilizations like Atlantis and Lemuria. Alice Bailey later described it as like an immense photographic film.
So Leadbeater really ran with it. This sounds like Theosophy was trying to establish some kind of hierarchy. Like, yes, psychic stuff happens, but our insights from these specific records are the reliable ones.
That's a very good way to put it. If you connect it to the bigger picture, it functions as an epistemological solution for them. You had this explosion of spiritualism in the late 19th century, lots of mediums, seances, but also lots of accusations of fraud, including against Blavatsky herself, actually. So Theosophy wanted to position itself as a more rigorous, almost scientific approach, occult science, they called it, by saying, look, the stuff most mediums access on the lower astral plane is just illusion, Maya. The real records are on the higher mental plane, only accessible to advanced masters or their trained disciples. Well, that let them dismiss inconvenient or contradictory claims and consolidate their own authority.
Ah, I see. So it explains away the noise while elevating their own insights. Clever. So what does this all mean for how the concept developed? It ended up being a real mix, didn't it?
Absolutely. It wasn't purely Eastern philosophy. It blended with 19th century scientific concepts like the luminiferous ether, this idea of an invisible medium filling space that scientists were exploring then. And it even pulled in concepts familiar to the West, like the Christian idea of the Book of Life. It became this true hybrid, a syncretic concept.
Okay, so from these theosophical roots, the idea started to spread and change. Our sources highlight two really influential figures who took it in quite different directions: Rudolf Steiner and Edgar Cayce. Let's start with Steiner.
Right. Steiner, who founded anthroposophy, he really used the Akashic Records as a primary, let's call it a research tool. He used it to build out this vast, detailed, esoteric history. Between about 1904 and 1908, he published works claiming he'd read the Akashic Records, his spelling, to describe Atlantis and Lemuria in great detail.
And he didn't stop there, did he? There was something called the Fifth Gospel.
Yes, later he claimed to have clairvoyantly read details about Jesus Christ's life that aren't in the standard Gospels, things like his time with the Essenes, even specific conversations.
So for Steiner, the records were basically this unimpeachable source of data. It allowed him to create an entire spiritual science covering everything from cosmology to, well, even Waldorf education ultimately draws on these ideas.
He presented it as completely factual, but this raises an important question, doesn't it? How reliable were these readings?
What do critics say?
Critics point out that Steiner's descriptions, particularly of ancient races or even in the Fifth Gospel, seem to reflect, well, the cultural and sometimes problematic ideological biases of his era. Some find anti-Semitic undertones or descriptions reflecting colonialist views, which suggests, to skeptics at least, that this channeled information might actually be a product of his own subconscious, shaped by his personal background and the societal norms of his time, rather than an objective cosmic record.
That's a critical perspective to consider. Now, Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, he took a very different path with the records, didn't he?
A very different path indeed. Cayce really shifted the focus away from grand esoteric history and towards personal healing and guidance.
And he made it more accessible, is that right?
Absolutely. What's fascinating is his directness. He explicitly equated the Akashic Records with the biblical Book of Life or God's Book of Remembrance. This immediately made the concept much more familiar and acceptable to a predominantly Christian American audience at the time.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And his work was very practical.
Overwhelmingly practical. His Association for Research and Enlightenment has archives of over 14,000 documented readings. Most were either physical readings, diagnosing illnesses and suggesting treatments, often unconventional ones, or life readings.
Life readings. What did those cover?
Things like understanding your soul's purpose, karmic patterns from past lives, relationship dynamics, innate talents. It was really about understanding your life path. Quite a departure from Steiner's focus on, say, the evolution of Atlantis.
Definitely more personal.
Yes. And perhaps his most significant contribution, looking back, was what you might call the democratization of access. Unlike Theosophy's rather elitist model, where only masters could really read the records, Cayce suggested this universal resource was potentially available to everyone, that anyone could potentially learn to attune to it. This really paved the way for the modern New Age view of the records as a kind of spiritual self-help tool.
But there was a caveat there too, wasn't there? About the reader's influence.
Yes. A crucial nuance. Cayce himself admitted that any reading is, and I quote roughly here, unavoidably shaded by the mental experience and background of the person reading the information, unless their intention is completely selfless and aligned.
So even Cayce acknowledged a layer of subjectivity, depending on the reader's own mind and motives.
Exactly. So you could say Cayce effectively Americanized the Akashic Records. He stripped away some of the more complex, high-occult European baggage from Theosophy and Steiner and reframed them as a practical spiritual technology for personal growth, healing, and well-being.
Okay, so fast forward to today. Given all this history and evolution, how were the Akashic Records typically described in contemporary esoteric or New Age thought? It sounds like it's moved beyond just ether or astral light.
Oh, definitely. Modern proponents often use technological metaphors. You hear things like the universe's supercomputer system, cosmic internet, or even the cloud. The idea is it's this vast, living, interactive dimension of consciousness, not just static storage.
And what's supposedly in this cosmic cloud?
Everything, apparently. The entire journey of every soul, including every single thought, word, feeling, action, intention, from the past, in the present, and even future possibilities. And crucially, it's seen as interactive, influencing our current lives.
Wow, that's comprehensive.
Yeah.
Is it just a free-for-all data dump, or is there some kind of organization with your gatekeeping?
Ah, yes, there's a whole spiritual bureaucracy, you could say. A hierarchy of non-physical light beings are described. At the very top, you have the Lords of the Records. They're the ultimate guardians, determining who gets access and what information is appropriate to receive. You supposedly never interact with them directly.
Okay, the big bosses. Who do you interact with then?
That would be the masters, teachers, and loved ones, often abbreviated as MTLOs. They act as the direct interface. The masters help locate the specific records you need, the teachers help you understand and interpret the information, and the loved ones, beings from your soul family across lifetimes, apparently offer comfort and support during the process.
So it's not just a library. It comes with librarians, tutors, and a support group.
Pretty much. And what this structure does, psychologically perhaps, is create what some call a cosmology of comfort. It directly addresses deep human fears of meaninglessness or being alone. It paints a picture of a universe where every single life, every thought is significant, meticulously recorded, and constantly supported by this benevolent spiritual team.
It certainly makes the universe feel like a much more personalized, supportive, and, well, safer place, almost therapeutic. So if someone wants to tap into this system, how do they supposedly do it? Our sources mentioned several methods. It's not like flipping a switch, right?
No, it's usually presented as a spiritual practice, a discipline. The most common method described today involves reciting a specific sacred prayer, often called a pathway prayer. This is seen as a kind of vibrational key that grants access.
A vibrational key. Interesting. What else?
Meditation and visualization are also really key. Practitioners often guide people to visualize entering a specific place, like a spiritual library or crystal cave where the records are housed. Or they might focus on energy centers, chakras, like the third eye or the soul star chakra above the head.
And vibration seems important too.
Yes, there's a strong emphasis on raising your personal energetic vibration. The idea is you need to match the high frequency of the records. So practices that cultivate love, gratitude, peace, maybe yoga, breath work, spending time in nature are often considered prerequisites.
And historically, there was hypnosis too, like with Cayce.
Exactly. Hypnosis and trance states were Cayce's primary method, and they're still recognized as one way to potentially access this information by bypassing the conscious mind's filters.
So once someone uses one of these methods and feels connected, what's the actual experience like? Is it like watching a movie of a past life?
Usually not that dramatic, based on most accounts. It's often described as a much more subtle, though profound, shift in awareness.
Subtle how?
People consistently report energetic and physical sensations, maybe feeling lightheaded, tingling, a sense of warmth or pressure, particularly around the head or heart.
And emotionally.
A very common report is an overwhelming feeling of unconditional love and peace. Just being immersed in this incredibly supportive, non-judgmental energy, it often brings people to tears, but usually tears of relief or joy.
Okay, and cognitively.
An expansion of consciousness, a sense of perception broadening beyond its normal everyday limits, a feeling of connection to something much larger than the individual self.
And how does the actual information come through? Is it always visual?
No, it tends to come through various intuitive channels, often called the clair senses. It seems to align with however an individual naturally receives intuitive information. So it could be clairvoyance, clear seeing, getting mental images, symbols, maybe brief scenes, or claircognizance, clear knowing, just suddenly having a deep inner understanding without knowing how you know.
Or hearing things?
Right, clairaudience, clear hearing internal voices, sounds, maybe music, and clairsentience. Clear feeling, receiving information through emotions or physical sensations in your own body, like feeling someone else's past pain or joy.
It sounds like this whole process, the prayers, the meditation, the focus on vibration, interpreting these subtle clair senses, could be seen as a kind of technology of the self.
That's a really insightful way to frame it. The practices themselves reliably produce certain subjective states, feelings of peace, expanded awareness, intuitive hits. And the belief system around the Akashic Records provides a framework for interpreting those very states as proof of connection to this external metaphysical reality.
So the truth of the records becomes deeply intertwined with the feeling of the experience itself.
Exactly. The subjective experience becomes self-validating within that framework.
So let's talk about the appeal. Why do people engage with the Akashic Records today? What's the big promise? Our sources really highlight this idea of profound personal transformation.
Absolutely. The primary draw for many seems to be deep healing, but it's framed as healing operating on a soul level. This often involves identifying and releasing things like past life traumas or limiting ancestral patterns that are believed to be manifesting as current issues, maybe fears, phobias, or repeating negative patterns in life.
So it offers an explanation for current struggles by linking them to a deeper soul history. What else?
Gaining clarity of purpose is huge. People want to understand their soul blueprint, you know? What are my innate gifts? What are the key life lessons I'm here to learn? Accessing the records is said to provide this kind of personal roadmap.
That sounds very empowering.
It is, and it extends to understanding and improving relationships, too. The idea is you can uncover the karmic ties or soul contracts you might have with people in your life, leading to more compassion and resolution.
As all mentions of abundance?
Yes, clearing blocks to abundance. And that's usually defined broadly, not just financial wealth, but abundance in love, health, joy, opportunity. The process involves identifying and releasing the limiting beliefs, maybe from past lives or this life, that are holding you back.
So ultimately, it seems the promise is about empowerment, learning to trust your inner guidance, increasing self-awareness, and feeling like you can consciously co-create the reality you desire.
Precisely. And what's fascinating here, if you step back, is how this reveals what you might call the spiritualization of therapy. It takes the language of modern psychotherapy healing trauma, understanding patterns, releasing limiting beliefs, but reframes it all within a metaphysical context.
So instead of just a psychological pattern, it's a past life echo.
Exactly. A persistent fear isn't just anxiety, it's a residue from a past life. A difficult relationship isn't just about incompatibility, it's a karmic lesson you both agreed to learn. This offers potentially very comforting explanations for suffering, and it imbues personal struggles with a sense of profound spiritual meaning and purpose.
Okay, let's pivot slightly. How does this concept of the Akashic Records compare to more established ideas? Our sources often draw parallels, especially with the biblical Book of Life and Carl Jung's collective unconscious. Let's take the Book of Life first.
Right, that comparison is very common, largely thanks to Edgar Cayce popularizing it. In Judaism and Christianity, the Book of Life is generally understood as a celestial ledger, where God records the names of the righteous, those destined for salvation, or sometimes their deeds for judgment.
So, similar idea of a divine record, but are there key differences?
Oh, absolutely. Huge differences, actually. First, the purpose. The Book of Life is fundamentally judgmental and soteriological. It's about salvation or damnation. The Akashic Records, as presented today, are explicitly therapeutic, educational, non-judgmental, and focused on soul growth and love.
What about the content and accessibility?
The Book of Life traditionally contains names, maybe key deeds, for judgment. The Akashic Records are described as holding everything, every thought, emotion, intention, plus future possibilities, granular detail, and accessibility. The Book of Life is God's private record, essentially. The Akashic Records are claimed to be accessible, at least potentially, to anyone properly trained or attuned.
And the underlying framework?
The Book of Life fits within a linear, Abrahamic, monotheistic worldview. The Akashic Records operate within a cyclical framework involving reincarnation and karma.
So comparing them is really more of a strategy.
It seems like a conceptual grafting, yeah.
Yeah.
Borrowing the familiarity and perceived authority of a well-known religious concept to make the newer, esoteric ideas seem more legitimate or understandable.
Okay, what about Carl Jung's collective unconscious? That's a major concept in depth psychology. How did that comparison stack up?
Jung proposed the collective unconscious as this deeper, inherited layer of the human psyche that's common to all people. It's not personal, it's universal. And it's structured by what he called archetypes, these universal patterns or predispositions for experience, like the hero, the mother, the shadow, the self. They shape our myths, dreams, and instinctive behaviors.
So, again, a deep universal layer of something. How is it different from the records?
Key difference is the nature of the content. The collective unconscious contains universal patterns, potentialities, blueprints for experience. The Akashic Records are described as a quasi-historical archive of actual events, thoughts, emotions, possibilities. One is like the underlying operating system, the other is like a massive database of user files.
And their function.
The collective unconscious, for Jung, is an inherent part of the psyche we integrate for psychological wholeness, for individuation. The Akashic Records are generally viewed as an external database you consult for specific information, guidance, or healing.
And their status.
Jung's theories, while certainly debated and not without controversy, are foundational within depth psychology and have influenced many fields. The Akashic Records remain largely within the realm of metaphysics or New Age spirituality and are considered pseudoscientific by mainstream academia.
So, similar to the Book of Life comparison, equating the records with the collective unconscious seems like an attempt to borrow some of the intellectual credibility associated with Jungian psychology.
It often appears that way, yes.
Yeah.
It helps frame the records in a more psychologically sophisticated light.
Right. So that brings us squarely to the scientific perspective. What does science have to say about the Akashic Records?
Well, from a strictly scientific standpoint, which relies on empirical evidence, testability, and falsifiability, there's really no ground to support the existence of the Akashic Records as they're described. It falls into the category of pseudoscience because the claims are inherently non-falsifiable. You can't design an experiment to definitively prove or disprove the existence of a non-physical library of all thoughts and deeds.
What about fields like parapsychology that study psychic phenomena?
Parapsychology has been researching phenomena like clairvoyance and telepathy for over a century, and frankly, it hasn't produced consistent, reproducible evidence that meets standard scientific criteria. Results are often small, fleeting, or explainable by other factors, and historical claims related to accessing such records, like Blavatsky's or Leadbeater's accounts of Atlantis, were often shrouded in controversy, lacked independent verification, and sometimes involved accusations of outright fraud.
I've also seen attempts to link the records to quantum physics, maybe ideas about a universal field or holographic memory.
Yes, figures like Ervin Laszlo have proposed models involving a quantum vacuum or a field that might store information holographically. But these are generally considered highly speculative analogies by mainstream physicists. They're using the language of quantum physics metaphorically rather than providing concrete, testable scientific evidence for the Akashic records themselves.
Okay, so science finds no evidence, but people do report having powerful, meaningful, sometimes life-changing experiences when they believe they're accessing the records. How does psychology explain that subjective experience?
Psychology offers several potential mechanisms that could explain these experiences without resorting to metaphysics. One key concept is cryptomnesia.
Cryptomnesia.
Oh,
That's
very-
like hidden memory,
Listen,
right?
exactly. It's when a forgotten memory resurfaces, but the person doesn't recognize it as a memory. They mistakenly believe it's a new, original thought or insight. So, detailed information about a historical period or a vivid scene that feels like a past life could potentially be reconstructed from things you read, saw in movies, or overheard years ago and consciously forgot, but which remain stored in your subconscious. There are documented cases of this, like mediums recalling obscure facts they'd actually read in a newspaper years prior but forgotten. Confabulation and suggestion are also highly relevant, especially when people are in altered states of consciousness, like deep meditation, hypnosis, or even just a highly suggestible, receptive state during a reading. The mind can weave together fragments of memory, fantasy, and information suggested by the practitioner or the context, creating elaborate, vivid narratives that feel intensely real and personally meaningful, even if they lack factual accuracy. Research into past life regression, for instance, shows that belief and the hypnotist's suggestions are powerful factors in shaping the reported experiences.
And cognitive biases must play a role, too.
Oh, absolutely. Confirmation bias is huge. We tend to remember the hits, the statements that resonate or seem accurate, and forget the misses, the vague or incorrect statements. Practitioners, consciously or unconsciously, might also use cold reading techniques, making high probability guesses, asking leading questions, using flattering or general statements that apply to many people, which can create a powerful impression of psychic accuracy. And someone seeking a reading is often in an emotionally vulnerable state, making them more receptive and less critical.
Okay, that covers the information side. But what about those powerful feelings, the oneness, the peace, the love, the sense of expanded consciousness? Is that just brain chemistry?
Well, the field of neuroscience of mystical experience, sometimes called neurotheology, studies the brain activity associated with these states, and they have found correlations. For instance, studies often show decreased activity in parts of the parietal cortex during deep meditation or mystical experiences. This brain region is involved in orienting us in space and maintaining our sense of a separate self. When its activity decreases a process sometimes called differentiation, it's hypothesized that this could lead to the subjective feelings of oneness, boundary dissolution, timelessness, and connection to something larger.
So the brain state matches the reported feeling.
Yes. Also, psychological traits like absorption, the tendency to become deeply engrossed in imaginative or sensory experiences, are strongly linked to the likelihood of having mystical type experiences.
But this leads to the core dilemma, doesn't it?
Exactly. For a skeptic, finding these neural correlates confirms that the experience is all in the head. It's a product of brain activity. But for a believer, the brain is simply the receiver. The brain activity doesn't cause the experience. It reflects the brain's processing of a genuine transcendent reality it's tuning into.
So the subjective experience itself, the feeling of peace,
Yeah.
oneness, insight, is undeniably real to the person having it. The fundamental disagreement is about the source or interpretation of that experience. Is it brain-generated or received from elsewhere? And that comes down to belief.
Precisely. Science can describe the correlates, but it can't definitively settle the metaphysical question of the ultimate source.
Okay, so this brings us to the modern landscape. The Akashic Records aren't just a concept anymore. They're a service. People offer readings, courses, certifications. If someone is curious about this, what should they know about navigating this marketplace?
Well, you're right. There's a vast ecosystem out there now. Practitioners, online courses promising to teach you how to access your own records, various certification programs. It's really become part of the broader spiritual marketplace, which, is part of a larger trend where spiritual growth and self-discovery are often packaged and presented as purchasable services or products.
And because this field is largely unregulated, ethics become incredibly important, right? What should someone look for in an ethical practitioner?
Absolutely critical. Ethical practitioners, based on codes of ethics emerging within these communities themselves, should ideally uphold several key principles. One is competence and accurate representation. They should only offer services they're actually trained or skilled in. Crucially, they shouldn't be giving medical, legal, or financial advice unless they are actually licensed professionals in those fields. An Akashic reading is not a substitute for professional advice. Informed consent. Before a session, you should get clear information about what the service involves, what its limits are, confidentiality, fees, and your rights as a client. Confidentiality is paramount. Your information should be kept private. And a big one. A practitioner should never access someone else's records, like a spouse's or child's, without that person's explicit, informed consent. That's considered a profound violation of spiritual privacy.
That makes sense. And avoiding harm.
Yes, avoiding harm and exploitation. This means no fear-mongering, like claiming you have curses or negative entity attachments that only they can remove for an extra fee. It also means not fostering unhealthy dependency and avoiding any kind of financial or emotional exploitation. And finally, maintaining professional boundaries. Avoiding dual relationships, like being a reader for your friend, romantic partner, or employee, helps keep the interaction clear and ethical.
So given those ideals, what are some clear red flags people should watch out for if they're considering getting a reading? Signs that maybe this practitioner isn't ethical or is potentially fraudulent.
There are definitely some recurring red flags. A big one is fear-mongering and upselling. Any practitioner who tells you you're cursed, have dark entities attached, or are in spiritual danger, and then immediately says only they have the special power to fix it, usually for a hefty extra fee. That's a major warning sign. Run, don't walk.
Like what else?
Guaranteed outcomes in fortune-telling. Be very wary of anyone who guarantees specific results, like finding your soulmate by next Tuesday or getting rich, or who claims 100% certainty about future events. Ethical practitioners usually frame insights as guidance, potentials, possibilities to empower you, not as fixed predictions or magic spells.
That distinction seems important.
It is. Another red flag is fostering dependency. Does the practitioner constantly suggest you need more sessions, more courses, more clearings from them, or do they empower you to trust your own intuition and find your own answers? The goal should be empowerment, not dependence.
What about their reputation?
Lack of verifiable reputation or transparency. Are they hard to find online? Do they have no independent reviews or testimonials? Are they vague or unwilling to discuss their training, background, or approach? A legitimate practitioner usually has some professional presence and is open about their practice.
Any other behavioral signs during a session?
Unprofessional conduct. Things like the practitioner using the session time to trauma dump their own personal problems, appearing ungrounded or scattered, pressuring you into buying more services immediately, or violating those professional boundaries we talked about. Trust your gut feeling. If something feels off, it probably is.
This all highlights a really fascinating tension, doesn't it? Something our sources called sacred commerce. On one hand, the records are described as this divine universal birthright, freely available to everyone in spirit.
And yet, on the other hand, practitioners are selling access to them, teaching courses for fees, certifying people. It creates an inherent conflict sometimes.
How so?
Well, the spiritual message is often about empowerment. You have this connection inherently. You can access this yourself. But the business model often relies on the message. But it's difficult. It requires special training. It's much clearer if you work with an expert like me. Let me teach you or do it for you for a fee. That commercial necessity of attracting and retaining clients can sometimes conflict with the spiritual imperative to truly empower clients towards their own independence and inner authority. It's a tightrope walk, and it opens the door to potential ethical pitfalls if not navigated carefully.
That's a really insightful point about the inherent tension there. So after this deep dive, what's the bottom line on the Akashic Records? What does it all tell us?
Well, it's clear they aren't some ancient, immutable truth handed down unchanged through millennia. It's really a distinctly modern myth, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, a fascinating modern construction, a blend of repurposed Eastern philosophy, 19th century Western occultism, bits of psychologized spirituality, even echoes of scientific and religious ideas. A true melting pot.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, I think its enduring allure, why it resonates with so many people today, lies in its power to provide this comprehensive framework for meaning. It offers a personalized, non-dogmatic cosmology. It tells you your life matters, every detail is recorded, you're supported by spiritual guides, and even suffering has a higher purpose or karmic lesson. That narrative is profoundly comforting in a world that can often feel chaotic or meaningless.
It certainly is comforting, and it also beautifully illustrates that gap, maybe that unbridgeable chasm, between subjective experience and objective explanation. Science and psychology offer compelling, evidence-based explanations for the experience. People report things like cryptomnesia, confabulations, suggestions, specific patterns of brain activity during meditation. But for the person who genuinely feels they've accessed something profound, those explanations don't necessarily negate the personal validity or the transformative impact of the experience itself.
Exactly, and this raises that important question again. For someone who has found deep healing, clarity, a sense of purpose, maybe profound peace through what they believe was an Akashic reading, that experience is its own proof on a personal level. The belief system persists and thrives, not because it's empirically verifiable in a lab, but because it provides a powerful, emotionally resonant narrative, a way to interpret one's inner life, make sense of challenges, and navigate those fundamental existential questions about who we are and why we're here.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? Perhaps the true takeaway isn't just about whether cosmic libraries are real or what neurotransmitters are firing. Maybe it's more about reflecting on that enduring human search, our deep need for meaning, for healing, for connection, and perhaps for that comforting assurance that our stories, our lives, are somehow written down, significant, and will never truly be lost. We really hope this deep dive has given you some surprising facts, maybe some new perspectives to consider. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and stay well informed.